Hi Year 11, welcome to the first of hopefully a few interventions which we will record for you and save onto your English G Suite student page so that you can access and complete this intervention or this workshop in your own time, and hopefully you find it helpful. We'd love to hear some feedback on it afterwards, please, and let us know what else you want. Don't be afraid to tell your classroom teachers or tell myself, Miss Gordon or Mr. Want anytime you see us. We'd really appreciate it because obviously we want to help you. So enjoy. Before we get started, we just need to clarify that this narrative question, it is a 40-mark question and it forms section B of your GCSE Language Component 1 exam. So this is what we have been studying on your return to school. So along with the 20th century fiction section A, where you have 5 questions, section B then is your narrative writing. You get a choice of 4 titles in the exam. Now these are all unseen. We have no idea what they are. But we can, when I come to reading the questions and going through them, you'll see that they follow a similar pattern over the years. When you get into that exam, you need to read all 4 of the titles and then choose the title that you can feel the inspiration for. You have 45 minutes for this section of the exam, so you should be spending 1 hour on section A and leave yourself 45 minutes for section B. It's very important to Year 11 that you time yourself, because this is part of the exam technique as well. You have to keep an eye on the clock, and there's not going to be a teacher there to prompt you during the exam. So please be mindful of that and time yourselves doing questions at home. Definitely 45 minutes. Please, please, please do not spend any less than that, because section B is actually worth half the marks of the exam paper. So it's not worth your while not leaving yourself enough time for this section. And that's my advice to you. And I'm sure your teachers have all said the same. You need to write about 450 to 600 words. That's about a side and a half to 2 sides of A4. Don't worry, you don't need to count how many words you put in a line or anything like that. You don't need to be very, very strict to the word count, but just make sure that you're writing between a side and a half to 2 sides of A4, because you need that amount of writing to make sure that you complete a full narrative, and I'll talk more about that later. Although you may choose to describe events, places or people to enhance your writing, remember this is not a piece of descriptive writing, and that's why I keep coming back and calling it narrative writing, meaning it needs to have a plot. If you just describe things, you're not fulfilling the success criteria in order to get a good mark on this piece of writing, please. So remember, yes, it's great to be descriptive in your writing, but you need to actually form an entire story. There's 24 marks for communication and organisation. So what this means is how clear you are in telling your story. Can you organise that story? Does it have a clear open? So aside from having, a varied sentence structure and paragraphs, do you have actually an opening to your story? Can you build up to a problem? And do you have a resolution, like a clear ending for your story? And then 16 marks for your SPAG. And obviously that SPAG it's not as simple as spelling everything correctly, because you're better off chancing to use an ambitious word. Even if you're worried about spelling it wrong, it's better for you overall that if you take the risk and use that ambitious vocabulary rather than playing it safe because you'll spell it correctly. So this question, this narrative writing, is worth 40 marks, and that's 20% of your total language mark. So I'm just going to reinforce what I said earlier there about making sure that you leave yourself at least 45 minutes for this section. What was really apparent through your feedback on the Google form, thank you by the way for doing that, was that some people were confused when it came to narrative writing. They didn't understand that it was part of the fiction paper. I think some people thought it was non-fiction writing or transactional writing, and I understand there was a bit of confusion in the difference. And I'm going to try and clarify that now, because perhaps some people were confused because you may remember your teachers telling you to write about real life experiences. Now, this is something the exam board has told us in feedback on training for teaching and marking in school when we're teaching you the language papers. And I just want to explain what they mean by that. When they say write from real life experience, what they are saying is to use your personal experience to fuel your storytelling here. Now, why you've been given that advice is because it's easier to access a narrative if it's personal. That means it's easier for you to think of something if you have some kind of experience with it. Now, writers in the real world, I always use J.K. Rowling for this example because she's the only one that pops to head really. But when she was crafting the character of Snape in Harry Potter, she's nearly forgot the name of it there, she actually based the character of Snape on a science teacher she had in school and just changed his name and changed a couple of things about him because obviously he wasn't a wizard. So when we tell you to write from real life experience, we mean to draw on the people around you for fuel for your characters. Draw from stories, not that have just happened to you, but things that have happened to your friends and your family, and use that to craft a story. For example, you could actually write about something that is legitimately your experience, happened to you or somebody really close in your family, but you might change it from first person to third person and change everybody's names. Or you might have something that maybe happened to one of your friends or a friend of a friend, and you just thought, oh, that was just hilarious. And you just change it from third person into first person. So I do understand the line between fact and fiction can become really blurry, but just remember, it doesn't have to be true to be a personal experience. You can experience emotions. Like, you know what your body, how your body reacts if you're feeling happy, how your body reacts if you're feeling angry. You have seen people cry. You know, you've seen how they slump into their chair. Maybe they look defeated. You can describe that because you've experienced it. That is your personal experience. So yeah, just to recap, you could tell a story, a true story, all from your own experience, but write it as if it were fiction, with fictional characters in the third person. You could create a completely fictional story, but then tell it in first person so that it has the same feel as a personal narrative. Or you could tell a true story that happened to someone else, but write it in first person as if you were that person. For example, I wrote a short story for my friend a couple of weeks ago. You're going to laugh at this now, year 11. But she went on a date after lockdown. And of course, it was her first date in, I don't know how many months. Could it be 8 or 9 months anyway? And it was hilarious. And she sent me a voice note actually on WhatsApp. And this voice note was about 10 minutes long, and I was laughing so much. So I decided to write it into a short story and send it back to her. And, you know, that's an example of what we want you to do. And it wasn't very long. It was about 2 sides of A4.
And here's where it gets tricky. I'm Miss McIntosh, and I'm here to talk to you about the tricky part of picking the right kind of story. We've just discussed that you should pick something that's really rooted in your personal experience, something that you can describe with authenticity and detail, that you can give us a sense of place and space and time and feelings and emotions. But then you get these titles, and some of them will make you make wrong choices. The first one here is The Fugitive. That's going to immediately make you think about all the things that you're explicitly not supposed to do, like ninjas and assassins and murders. My group is always writing about murder. I have to beg them not to write about blood. The Journey of a Lifetime. That one too could be a terrible, terrible mistake. And everyone said you should never go back, but I could not resist. I know at least 30 of you are already inspired to write something about a dead body. No dead bodies. That's the law. Right, so I'm going to take you to the next slide, where I think of some of my story choices based on those titles. So, It's absolutely true that you should not plan a story beforehand, only one story, and shoehorn it into a title. Because if you do that awkwardly, they can tell you've done it and the examiner hates it and they will lop you off at least 30% of your marks to even begin with. But it's also true that you very much can have a sort of set of incidents or stories or experiences that you have swirling around in your head, that you've practiced written in class, that you've maybe done some sample writing of and shown your family or your teacher. We're very happy to look at your work, maybe not take it in and mark it because we don't enjoy that, but read it on the spot and say, here's what needs a bit more, here's what needs a bit less, this works, this doesn't. So I've looked at these titles and I've come up with some things from my very silly life with some stories to go with it. So the time I got held up at gunpoint in West Philadelphia. That one actually works for me for a time when you felt ashamed of yourself, or The Fugitive. For everyone said you should never go back, but I could not resist. I thought about going and cleaning out my grandmother's house, my grandparents' house, after my grandfather had died and my grandmother had gone into a care home. And the experience of that, of being in their empty house, how it felt, what we found, old photo albums. Very emotional. And so I'm actually going to move away from that one because I don't feel like sharing my precious emotions with the examiner. This one, The Fugitive, one thing the examiners particularly love, they love it when you take a very serious sounding title and write a very arch, amused version of it. So here I would write a very serious version about the one afternoon when I ate 2 whole packets of Maryland cookies. By the way, you pronounce that Maryland, not Maryland, children. And lied about it. It was possibly the worst afternoon of my childhood life. I ate these cookies while my parents were out, and then when they came in, they were like, let us have a cookie. And there were no cookies, children. There were no cookies left at all because I'd eaten them. But I lied about it because I was terrified of what would happen. Answer, nothing, but I was still terrified. And we spent the next half hour searching the house for the cookies, with my shame mounting and mounting, so I can absolutely conjure up every emotion and every detail of the house we lived in and all the places we looked until my brother, the knock, found the empty packets in the bin and the truth came out. The Journey of a Lifetime, another sort of ironic one. I think almost all of us have decided at some point in childhood, whether seriously or in a performative outrage with our parents, that we're going to run away from home. And we've packed a bag and we've thought about it. And it's a generic story because it's such a common story. So that one would work in the same sort of way. It would charm the examiner with The Fugitive, or A Time I Felt Ashamed of Myself, or A Journey of a Lifetime, right? Or Everyone Says You Should Never Go Back, but I Could Not Resist going back for the food my mum had made, or going back for my teddy I'd left behind. See how these stories can actually work very well with the titles, but you have to think about it. I, like so many people in this school, have one of my parents is from another country, from America, so all of my childhood, our holidays, were going to stay with grandparents or going to visit family. I know that's true of everybody in my form and most people in my class, is that we have lots of experience with other places that we can describe vividly that aren't London. So if you have that Journey of a Lifetime, I've written here, I could write very vividly about arriving in the airport in Dhaka, the year I went to stay with a Bangladeshi friend, stepping out of the air conditioning into February in Dhaka in the middle of all the sounds and sensations and all the smells that are just completely unfamiliar to me, all the beautiful painting on the rickshaws, all people speaking, everyone calling me Appa Appa and asking for money. So I could definitely tell that well. And then a story, it doesn't have to be your own story. Here's a story about a nut allergy that I'm totally nicking off one of my year 11s who told me it the other week, about when he was 6 or 7 and wasn't entirely convinced that he was allergic to nuts. So in a Costa Coffee in Pinner, decided he might like to try this nut thing that theoretically he couldn't eat. That would work perfectly for Everyone Said You Should Never Go Back, but I Could Not Resist. It could work very well with Write About a Time When You Felt Ashamed of Yourself. So again, doesn't have to be your story. You can steal someone else's story if they've told it vividly. Of all those stories, obviously I'm going to tell you the story of being held up at gunpoint in Philadelphia because it's such a good story and I tell it so often that I'm really quite intimate with the details of that one. And obviously I remember it really well because how often do you get held up at gunpoint in West Philadelphia? Not often. It's not enough to just tell the story. In order for these stories to really work, and they're only very short stories, you've only got 40 minutes to write, a tiny number of words, it's really a moment we're writing about. The most successful stories give us a sense of the person speaking or the third person narrator describing that main character in space and place and time. It sounds a bit formulaic, but if you step through the very series of questions I've got here, you've written me a piece where I'm immediately there with you. And that one of the most critical things is that you show your emotional state through that description rather than telling us how you feel, right? So the questions I've got here: where are you? What time of day is it? What's the quality of the light? How does the temperature of the setting feel on your skin? What can you hear? What can you see? If the setting has pungent odours, be careful with smells, kids. What are they? And how do these sensory impressions physically make you feel? Not emotionally make you feel, physically. You're going to show us your emotions through the physical impressions. So I've written up just now the beginning of the held up at gunpoint in Philadelphia story. I'll read it to you. I leant against the cool metal of the bus shelter, laughing up at Rick. It was 3 in the morning in West Philadelphia, and it felt like the city belonged to us. 49th Street was a pool of silent darkness interspersed with soft pools of street light. I've used the word pool twice. I had $20 in rumpled bills in the pocket of my jacket, and as we talked, I played with the wedding ring on my finger. I was still getting used to wearing it. I was still getting used to him. I shivered slightly and unexpectedly. Autumn was beginning to make itself felt. Maybe it was a mistake to be out this late or early. Right, so if you're paying attention to your lessons on pathetic fallacy, you'll see that what we've got there begins as a description that's all about intimacy and calm and peace and love. We know I'm brand new married by the end of the story because I mentioned the wedding ring, but I don't tell us I had just got married to the man who was called Rick. There's only one character there mentioned by name. You're allowed at most 2 or 3 characters mentioned by name. No teams of ninjas, no Bob and Jane and Kamal come running in and do things. None of them. 2 or 3 characters at most. Reading back there, I see there's some awkwardness. I've repeated words a couple of times, but generally you can see by the end of it, autumn's beginning to make itself felt. Bad things are about to happen. And here's where we step it up even more, because even though I've just established us in space and time, we've got this interesting pathetic fallacy going on. We know we're in West Philadelphia. We know we've got a newly married person. We know that we don't quite know who we trust and something's about to happen. It could be even more interesting. And that's when we turn to our best friends, kids, memes. You know this one: record scratch, freeze frame. Yup, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up in this situation. Now, never literally write that out, but you're all familiar with that meme. You all know how it works. You start with the dramatic conclusion, and then you stop there and go back to the beginning. So I can take that story, but instead of starting with me leaning against the bus stop, I'm going to start with the dramatic conclusion. When I finally started thinking clearly, the first thing I saw was the barrel of the gun. It was impossible to miss, really. It was pointing directly at the centre of my forehead. Much more dramatic that way.
That is an excellent suggestion, Miss McIntosh. So back to me, back to myself, Miss Gordon, again, year 11. And I'm actually going to pick up and use some of Miss McIntosh's ideas there because I really, really like what she said. So I'm just going to go through how I would plan write about a time when you felt ashamed of yourself. And Miss McIntosh has inspired me with her story. And instantly it came to mind, God, I was young and I feel so bad now thinking back of it, but I'm sure some people could relate if you have siblings. My story took place on Christmas morning, I woke up, you know, I was still young enough to believe in Santa Claus, I think, or maybe I pretended, I can't really remember now. But I remember not liking my presents. I think I got like Barbies or something, and I'm just not a Barbie person. I never have been. Don't know what my parents were thinking that year. And my brother got a toy gun. I remember this toy gun. It was really, really long. It was like a toy rifle, and it was so cool. And I was so jealous. Like, I wanted the toy gun. The next bit I remember is that I was in my sitting room on my own with his toy gun. So I was like, oh my God, I'm going to play with this now when no one's around. And I was playing with it and I broke it. It was an accident. I did not break it on purpose. But I remember panicking and I hid the broken gun. I hid the evidence behind the couch. God, the memory. So bad, so naughty. It's like coming in flashes, actually, this memory. And then I remember my parents, we were trying to find it. My brother, he was only a year older than me, and you know, he was getting really upset, and he was like, where's my toy? So I pretended to look for it with my parents and my brother. I'll never forget my brother's face when he found the toy gun behind the couch. He was devastated. Honestly, he just cried. So mean. And of course I lied about breaking it. And obviously everybody knew it was me. So I kept the lie going for a while, as you do when you're young and you're just so afraid of getting in trouble. But I eventually confessed and I got into loads of trouble. So if you see the way I have bullet pointed that story in 5 bullet points, that's going to be the focus of each of my paragraphs. And I think I will do what Miss McIntosh has suggested on the slide before, and I'm going to write the closing first and try and make it really tense and dramatic. Okay, year 11. So here is my first draft of my first paragraph. I decided to lie and try and convince them that it wasn't me. My parents were staring at me. I could tell that they didn't believe me. I looked at my brother and could see he was upset, but that sadness would soon turn to anger and be directed at me. I was going to confess. Okay, you might look at that and you might think, oh, that's fine. Maybe it's something similar to what you write when you're doing your narrative writing and you're struggling to kind of upgrade this and push it further. Well, let me point out a couple of things about this paragraph. If you look at how each new sentence starts, you can see they start very similarly. I decided, I looked, I could tell, I was going to confess. So if you do something similar like that, if you start all your sentences the same way, and you always hear your teacher say, no, you need to vary your sentences or vary your sentence openers. Well, I'm going to show you how to do that. Here is a resource all about different ways of using sentences for effect, different types of sentences you can use in your narrative writing. I'll make this resource available for you to download, but I'm going to show you how to use it as well, because that can be quite intimidating if you just have that in front of you. And you don't need every single sentence to be like this, but just for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to select 3 different sentences and show you how I can rewrite that paragraph using them. So I decided to choose the sentence, the more sentence. And here's an example. The more he worried, the more he felt uncomfortable, the more he wanted to leave the room. I love a so-so sentence. Because it also allows me to use my punctuation for effect, actually. So I like this one. It's kind of a double whammy. There was one item so small, so unrecognisable, it didn't register. And then there's start with a simile sentence. Ugh, I hate this example, I have to say. Like a ghost caught in a fan, he spun round and round on the roundabout. No, don't ever use that. That's just awful. So I've started my sentence with a simile, but I've changed my simile to be more sophisticated, year 11. So let's have a look how I've redrafted that paragraph. Now, if you remember, I started my sentence with, I decided to lie and try and convince them that it wasn't me. So now that has become, the more I lied, the more I struggled to sound convincing, and the more ridiculous my story became. My next sentence was, my parents were staring at me. I could feel myself crumbling under the intense glare of my parents' disappointment. So that's where I'm using that emotional state to convey how them staring at me was making me feel. My next sentence was, I looked at my brother and could see he was upset. That becomes, I stole a glance at my brother. He was so upset, so devastated at his loss. But like a fire, the blind rage was sweeping over him. I was almost there. The shame had almost broken me. And I'm also linking back to my title there as well. So I want all of you, please, to give this a try. I want you to pick one of the titles. I want you to bullet point out your story like I did with the 5 bullet points. I want you to try Miss McIntosh's technique of starting with that kind of closing moment. And I want you to write your first draft and then redraft it with your sentence structure, please.
Thanks very much, Miss Gordon and Miss McIntosh. So much useful advice here. This is Mr. Want with a few tips as we just look at the last few slides. This first one is the mark scheme. It's worth you noting a couple of things. As you know, any narrative writing that you write will have 3 elements. It will have character, setting and plot. And you'll have thought about all of those in your planning. But the mark scheme just gives you a tip. There's a lot more marks on the left-hand side for characterization and organization. So you need to think very carefully about what change your character will go through and how the structure of your story will show that. Let me repeat that. Your character needs to go through some kind of change and your structure needs to show that. So you might describe them at the beginning and at the end, emphasizing that they've learnt something, or they look at themselves, or they look at the world or in a different way, or a relationship has changed. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a structure which might help you plan for that. You need to plan a structure which works for you and is a response to the task that's been put in front of you. And we do not want you to go into this exam with any pre-planned stories. Nevertheless, here's a structure which works very well, which some of you might choose to use. If you have a different structure, if your teacher has taught you a different way of planning, absolutely fine. But this is one you might want to add into your toolkit. As you can see, there's 5 stages to it. Let me talk you through them briefly. At the start, introduce your character. Show us what they're like in a variety of ways, how they walk down the street, how they say goodbye to whoever they're leaving, what they're wearing. But then you might also use the weather to describe their mood. The sun is shining, it is raining, and so on. The next step makes us care about your character by telling us what their goal is. What do they want? That way your reader is going to engage with them. The body of your writing can then go through 2 subsequent steps. A small obstacle, missing the bus, being late, which gets in the way of them achieving that goal. But then a much bigger obstacle, something which challenges them and brings out something else in their character. And here's the trick. At that stage, go back to your description of the weather or the setting, use a bit of pathetic fallacy to reveal a change in their character or a change in the mood. Then resolve your story. Perhaps they achieve their goal, perhaps they don't. Perhaps they achieve their goal but with a twist and there's a price to pay for it. We've got some good examples of stories which do this on the shared area. The medal is one, the meeting is another. Have a look at those and see if this is a structure you could use in your planning. Many of you will choose to have a climactic moment in your writing where inevitably the tension builds. Can we point out one important aspect of writing to build tension? You need to slow down, not speed up. Look at the first bit of writing. A less skillful writer might try and make things exciting this way. Quickly he ran into the room and immediately he grabbed the gun and then it exploded and suddenly he was running and then he got away. And you think by raising the speed, the pace of events, it gets more tense. It doesn't. It's the opposite. It's really tedious to read. Look at the second example. The door handle twitched in its casing and inch by inch by inch it turned while he watched. One finger and then another reached around the tired, faded paintwork. Slowing your description down is far more effective for building tension. Each year the examiners share a report on what students do well and how students can improve in each section of your English exams. The last couple of years they've started making this point that we want to share with you. You'll have just done a section A where you've answered some questions on some narrative writing. It would be a good idea to use that as a model. You could plan and write something similar to what you've just read. It's certainly a very good example of how long your time frame should be and the limits on how many characters you should have and the balance between description and action. You can even use some of the ideas. Have a look at the example on this slide that plans out a story loosely based and inspired by and as a response to Emma and Robbie on holiday, especially at the level of structure and planning. This might be a really good idea. You could even use the odd phrase. Be careful, be judicious, don't copy out large chunks, but phrases that you think have been effective, you might use and adapt in your own writing. Here's a nice tip about dialogue, borrowed from Miss McAllister, I think. Thank you very much, Miss. Firstly, can you make sure that you know how to punctuate dialogue? It's a common error and you need to be confident in it. We would recommend just 1 or 2 lines of dialogue. Don't overdo it. Don't tell your story through a conversation. But you should include some, not least because it shows control of a variety of punctuation which the examiners are looking for. The first example. Will we ever see each other again? He asked, wiping away a tear on his sleeve. Good bit of show, don't tell. A bit cliched, but some evocative dialogue. It's certainly better than the second one. Will we ever see each other again? He asked sadly. We don't want you to tell us how he feels. We want you to show us. The third example, again, it risks being a little cliched, but it's far more sophisticated. Will we ever see each other again? He asked. Outside, the wind dropped and a single cloud drifted on the horizon. As we've seen before, pathetic fallacy and the description of setting can be a really powerful and effective way of describing the state of mind of your character. You should try doing something similar. This task needs doing in 45 minutes. That's not 45 minutes writing. As you can see, we would recommend that you divide your time up this way. 10 minutes planning. When you're nervous in the exam, it's difficult to not just get started sometimes. There are a lot more marks for organisation and structure. Good writing is thought about. You foreshadow, you drop hints, you carefully construct where you're going to make your reader go back and read the start again for things that they missed. That takes planning. So 10 minutes at the start and then 30 minutes writing. But don't think that that's fixed. Don't think that your plan is fixed. You should go back over your plan, adding to it as new ideas come. Halfway through your writing, you might have the perfect idea for the perfect final line. Write it down. Don't ask your brain to hold it in mind for another 15-20 minutes while you write everything else. Go back to that plan, add to it. Get your sequence of events, get some vocabulary, get some phrases in. Have a think about the techniques you're going to use and where. And go back and forth. Go back and check on your plan while you're writing. Are you following it? And then, critically, do not hand in any work to us, to your teachers, but certainly not to an examiner that you haven't checked through. 5 minutes should do it to read it through. But be sensible about it. Know what you're checking for. Now is the time to look back over all the feedback and marking you've had from your English teachers in your 10 or 11 years of school. All those underlinings, all those circles, what is it they're pointing out? Have you taken the time to go away and brush up on your areas for development, the common mistakes that you make? Be smart about this. Look actively when you're checking through. There are so many resources online for the common errors that students make. Take responsibility for this, please. 10 minutes planning, 30 minutes writing, 5 minutes checking. You can use phrases, idioms, proverbs, all sorts of like words and selections of words that you hear around you should go into your writing. But you might play with them. You might adapt them. This one, I think it was Philip Pullman. Can't remember. It's sort of been rattling around my brain for years now. Read like a butterfly, write like a bee. Of course, he's paraphrasing Muhammad Ali, but he's inverted it around. Shows a certain facility with language and a light-hearted approach to his writing. But what does it mean? It means if you want to write well, you need to read a lot. But you also need to flit around and read widely. Read a variety of things. You should ideally be reading every day for about 20 minutes. It will have more impact than anything that you can do in class, anything your English teacher can do. You becoming a reader, reading every day, is possibly the most important thing that you could take away from this presentation. And then write like a bee, build up your stamina, write about things, write down your thoughts, your feelings, your experience. It's there's a bit of muscle memory here. Build up that skill, build up that stamina. I'm rambling here. I think it's probably time to end this presentation. Well done for getting this far. The best of luck. Come and see me or Miss Gordon or Miss McIntosh with any questions. Put some work in front of you, of us, and all the best.